Today, I'm going to be talking about if working at a startup is actually worth it. So, to discuss this topic, first, I'm going to provide a bit of a background and a little bit about my experience working at a startup. Then, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of working at a startup. And then I'll be answering the question, is working at a startup actually worth it? And then finally, I'm going to be giving some advice. So if you decide to work at a startup, I'll have some advice for how to make it a good experience. So let's jump right into it. So, for some background, I went to high school and college during the 2000s and 2010s. And this was a time where there were many stories about startups that were very successful. So think about, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Uber, Airbnb, Pinterest, YouTube. All of these companies were startups at one point that became huge. And so while I was in school during this time, it was almost impossible to avoid hearing about stories of these companies that started really small and then got super huge. There were so many people that were developing and releasing apps in the hopes that it would become like the next big thing, the next Uber, the next Airbnb. So it was extremely popular at this time to see, this huge boom of innovation and technology and people working on projects that they would hope turn into, like a success story from a small startup into this huge successful company. Also, during this time, the idea of high risk and high reward was extremely popular. So, this idea that people should take a big risk, and that's the quote only way that you could develop something huge. Another popular concept during this time was essentially techifying and optimizing everything. So there was this movement to try and create applications or release technology that would optimize and improve on what was existing, or even creating something that wasn't in existence at that time. So, this concept of endless optimization and like endless improvement was extremely popular. And so, as I was transitioning from school into the workforce, the idea of working at a startup was something that I definitely considered and was really enticing to me at the time. And it became a goal of mine to work at a startup at some point in my career. So I have experience working at a larger company, and I also have experience working at a startup. So I feel like I can share my perspective on kind of comparing the two and then providing insight on if working at a startup was actually worth it, in my opinion. So, first, I want to cover some of the pros of working at a startup, at least in my experience. So, the first major pro is that you're part of building something that's new and exciting, and you have a direct impact on whatever the final product is. I think this is super exciting because at a larger company, you don't necessarily get to have that immediate impact that you would at a startup. And startups are generally smaller, less people work at them. So in a sense, your voice is more amplified. Your opinions carry a lot more weight because there aren't as many people. So, you have the opportunity to actually speak up and voice your opinion about the direction that the company should be going. Whereas at a larger company, you wouldn't necessarily have that impact unless you're part of like the executive suite or, one of the vice presidents or kind of higher up in the company. But at a startup, it's a bit more of a level playing field. So there is that opportunity to really have impact and have your opinion heard. Another pro of working at a startup is that you have the opportunity to learn about other fields and other areas in the workforce that you wouldn't necessarily have had exposure to at a larger company. So, for example, let's say you specialize in finance and you're working at a startup and your job entails the financial aspect of the company. However, since it's a smaller company, you might know a software developer and you get to learn about what they do, and there's more opportunity to actually be exposed to other areas of the company. At a larger company, it's a lot harder to do this just because there are so many more people, and it might be harder to meet someone that works in another department. So you have to seek out those opportunities at a larger company more actively. Whereas at a startup, you can, the person that's a software developer or in another field might be sitting right next to you. So you can have those conversations in like a more informal environment. Another pro of working at a startup is the financial potential. And I think this is also what draws a lot of people to considering working at a startup, because we've seen so many success stories of, people dropping out of college and creating a startup and that startup being successful and then making really good money from it. I think this is an area that is really enticing to a lot of people. And it goes back to that concept of high risk, high reward. A lot of people might want to work at a startup because there is that potential for financial gain. And then also the sense of uncertainty of working at a startup can be really exciting and extremely fulfilling. When you're working at a smaller company, again, going back to a previous pro, is the fact that, you have an impact on what the final result of the startup can be. And that's a super exciting and very fulfilling feeling. And in general, sometimes not knowing what the outcome is going to be can be exciting for a lot of people. So I think working at a startup can be something that is exciting. You don't necessarily know what your day is going to look like. Every day could look extremely different. So that will definitely keep you interested in what's coming next. And then there's also this sense of collective ownership. So because it's a smaller company, you feel like you have a greater ownership of what the actual end product is. And this is a big pro because this is not something you might experience at a larger company. You might have impact in a small area of the company or within your specific department. But if you are at a startup, there is that idea of collective ownership so that you can actually have an impact on what the final result is, and you're all in the experience together. And so generally people that work at a startup are really passionate about what that end result is. So that collective ownership can be something that's a big benefit of working at a startup. And in that same vein, your coworkers are in the weeds with you. So although there are a lot of challenges of working at a startup, because there are fewer people that are involved, it's you kind of have that feeling of, your coworkers are going through the uncertainty with you. And that's a really big benefit that you might not necessarily get at a larger company. One pro that I experienced working at a startup is working with extremely smart and extremely talented people that I learned a lot from. And this was a big pro because I got to learn so much about different areas in the company, and I got to work with people that I would not have had the opportunity to work with at a larger company. So I got to learn a lot from really smart people, and that was one of the biggest benefits, in my opinion, of working at a startup. Another pro is that there is the potential to really grow with the company. So this is something that's really great because you can go through all the changes that happen, and you can learn a lot and you can have a big impact on what the final result is. Another pro is the sense of pride that you get because you're much closer to the product or output of the startup. So when you see that product succeeding, it's an extremely fulfilling feeling, and it's super exciting, and it's one of those experiences that can be pretty rare. So being able to experience that at a startup is a huge pro. And then finally, the last pro is that because startups are generally smaller, you get to know your coworkers really well. I felt that it was a lot easier to know who to actually go to if I had questions, or if there was a project I was working on, I knew who I could go to because there weren't that many people that I could ask. Or you learn how to figure it out on your own, and that can be an extremely fulfilling experience. Next, I'm going to cover some of the cons of working at a startup in my experience. So the first major con is that working at a startup can be a huge time commitment and sacrifice. There is a lot of work to do and not as many people to actually do the work. So it can be a really large time commitment. There were times when I was working at a startup where I would work a lot of weekends or late into the evenings or even on vacation. I think that's one of the major cons of working at a startup. Another con is that the compensation might be based on the startup's future potential. So there is a possibility that the pay is lower than the industry standard. The benefits might not be as generous as some of the other companies within the same field. And a lot of the pay structure for startups can be based on stocks and, potential for the company to IPO or be bought out. So that's a potential con because you might not necessarily get compensated compared to industry standard, at least upfront for a startup. Another con is that there is a large percentage of startups that actually fail. And I think this is really important because a lot of times in media, we only see startups that were extremely successful. So it can skew like the idea that every startup is successful, because that's definitely not true. And there is a large percentage of startups that unfortunately are not successful. So I think that's another con to think about. It can be very risky. Startups also tend to run pretty lean. So because startups are smaller, there might not be as many people working at the company. And this can be a con because you may end up working in areas that you're not interested in, or you may end up working in areas that you don't have as much experience in, so it might not be comfortable. Something that I experienced is that the priorities and workload can shift so unexpectedly when you're working at a startup. And this can be for a number of reasons, but usually it's related to a lack of a clear vision for the company or changing priorities of the company. So when you have a goal that's constantly changing, your workload can shift overnight or even within like the same day. Another con of working at a startup is that there may be a heavy focus on speed and, quote, doing what it takes to get it done. So this concept of getting shit done was extremely popular, at least at the startup that I was working at. So there were extremely high expectations, super fast turnaround times. And so this created a lot of stress, not only for me, but also for pretty much everybody working at the company, because we didn't know what to expect in terms of the workload, but we were expected to get it done as quickly as possible. So when you do something really quickly, there is a lot of potential for mistakes or not taking the time to think everything through. Is this the right thing to do? Should we be putting our investment into this project? Sometimes those questions are not asked at the beginning, and so you spend time working on it, and later on you realize that it wasn't a good use of time. When I was working at a startup, one of the analogies that I heard super frequently was, we are building the plane while trying to fly it. So I think that's a really great example of a potential con of working at a startup, is that there's a lot of uncertainty and you're trying to build this thing super fast and you're trying to make it work, but there's always that potential that it could fail in the end. Another con of working at a startup is that you need to be comfortable working in a super ambiguous environment. And this can be a pro, because again, it can be extremely exciting to work in this environment that's not necessarily structured or laid out. However, it can also be a con because working in an ambiguous environment can be extremely draining, because you never know what to expect. Priorities can change, your workload can change. A project that you spent a lot of time on could be cut completely, and then you're expected to work on something else because the goals of the company changed. Even if you work at a larger company, these types of changes do happen, but I feel like it's less frequent if you're working at a larger company. At a startup, there is that potential that you're constantly changing, and that can be very draining. And the final con that I have on this list is that everyone is burnt out and there is extremely high turnover. So this was true, at least for the startup that I was working at, because we were moving so fast and because the company ran lean and because the goals would change pretty frequently. It contributed to a lot of burnout of not only me, but a lot of my coworkers. And this is really challenging because it's tough to get anything done when you're burnt out, but it's even tougher when everyone around you is also burnt out. So it became difficult at times to actually get things done because everybody was collectively burnt out and we didn't know what to expect. So now that I've gone over the pros and cons of working at a startup, I want to answer the question of, is working at a startup actually worth it? And of course, my answer is going to be extremely generic, and it's going to be, it depends on the startup, because every single startup is so different. So I believe that it is worth it to work at a startup if you are prepared and know what you're getting yourself into. So one of the things I had a really hard time with was adapting to the ambiguity. And through working at a startup, I realized that I actually enjoy having more structure. That structured environment really helps me plan my day-to-day life and do things outside of work. So that's something that I learned about myself through the process of working at a startup. Although I learned that working at a startup was not for me, I definitely think it was worth it because I learned a lot and I made connections with a lot of extremely smart and talented people. And I gained skills that I would not have gained otherwise. So I certainly appreciate the experience that I had, and I believe it was worth it. But again, I think it really depends on the startup, and it depends on the projects that you're working on. It depends on your coworkers. It's just such a highly variable thing that it's hard to say. But at least in my experience, I believe it was worth it. If you decide to work at a startup, I wanted to share some pieces of advice that may be helpful. So the first piece of advice is actually for the interview process. So I would recommend asking about the startup's culture and how people within the startup communicate with each other, and if there are ways that the company tries to address burnout. My second piece of advice is a mindset shift. So I would say something that's really important if you're working at a startup is to get comfortable with not knowing exactly what your day is going to look like or what projects you're going to be working on, and get comfortable with working in an uncertain environment. I think this is a lot easier said than done. I had a really hard time working in an uncertain environment, so this was something that was very challenging for me. But I think even just putting yourself in that mindset that things are going to change frequently and just being okay with that, I think that'll set you up for success. My third piece of advice is super generic, but it's basically just ask questions. Ask as much as you can. Learn as much as you can about other employees. Learn about the product. Ask as much as you can. And ask about what are the goals of the company? Why did we change our mind on this project? Asking these questions can really be helpful, not only for you, but also for others within the company to make sure that everybody is on the same page. My next piece of advice is get really good at setting and enforcing boundaries. This is so much easier said than done. I had a very difficult time with this because of my people-pleasing personality. I wanted to do as much as I can, get it done quickly, get everything done as fast as possible. You could always reach me. You could reach me when I'm on vacation. You could reach me on the weekend. You can reach me in the evening. So I was really bad about setting boundaries. I think it's really important to protect your time because that will ultimately prevent burnout. And setting those boundaries is just a good practice, not only if you're working at a startup, but also in life in general. My next piece of advice is find humor in the chaos. So this is something that I definitely did a lot with my coworkers. Sometimes we would stay in the office late because we were trying to meet a deadline that was coming up. We would kind of cut the tension by trying to find ways to laugh at the situation, not being so serious about the situation and finding some humor in it at least helps in the moment if you're working on a really difficult project or if you're working on something that has a really tight deadline. My next piece of advice is to meet as many of your coworkers as possible and learn what their skill sets are, because you never know when that will come in handy. So you could potentially be working on a project and there is a question that requires a skill set that you don't have, but you remembered meeting one of your coworkers that has that skill set. Just being able to tap into those resources can be really useful. And that goes into my next piece of advice, which is ask for help and be upfront if you don't know how to do something. This is something I was really bad at because I tend to want to do everything myself, and I'm really bad about asking for help. And so what ended up happening was that I suffered in silence a lot. And that was not good for me. That was not good for my coworkers. That was not good for people in my personal life. I think one of the most important pieces of advice is to ask questions and ask for help, not only in a startup, but even in life in general. I think that's a very important concept. My next piece of advice is if everything is urgent, then nothing is urgent. In a startup, I think it's very important to get good at telling the difference between something that's actually urgent and something that's perceived as urgent. And performing this triage is extremely important because if you spend time working on something that you perceive as urgent but is not actually going to help move the company forward or contribute to, one of the goals that the startup might have, it's a waste of time. Some ways that you can tell the difference between what is urgent, what is actually urgent, and what is perceived as urgent is to ask a lot of questions. If you're being asked to work on a new project, but you've been working on something else for a while, a good question to ask is, which one's more important? Why is it more important? My next piece of advice is get comfortable with the idea of this is not perfect, but it's enough to get us started. And I believe this is very important because it's very easy, at least for me, to get caught up in all of the small little details and try to present something that's as polished as possible. But this was a big problem when I was working at a startup because everything was moving so fast. And so I ended up spending a lot of unnecessary time trying to perfect everything and perfect what I was presenting when I could have saved myself a lot of time and headaches if I would have just shared what was good enough. Doing what's enough to get you started is a really good philosophy, not only if you're working at a startup, but also at a larger company. And it's something that I still struggle with, but I'm trying really hard to get better at it. And then my final piece of advice, for working at a startup is ride and accept the waves and get comfortable with change. Things can change very frequently at a startup, so just accepting that and getting used to the idea that I'm just going to ride this wave. I'm just going to see where it takes me. I think that's something that's really important, and that could just keep you motivated and keep you sane, especially when everything around you might constantly be changing. And I think that this is also a good philosophy for, working at a larger company too. Again, there might be a lot of changes that happen at a large company as well. So just getting comfortable with accepting that, something might change, or priorities might change, or a project you work on might change. Just getting comfortable with that, I think, will just put you in a better mindset overall and help with your overall work experience. All right, that was a lot. We covered a lot of bases. But yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.